Hello everyone, and welcome to this 28th Reclaim webinar. We've got two speakers today, as usual, and we've got a few intro slides first. So if we can have next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit of information about the network. So the Reclaim network has 5 core partners. So it's led by Professor Prashant Kumar in Surrey and co-led by myself, Professor Laurence Jones at UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And we have the other core partners are Dr Thomas Kjeldsen at University of Bath, who's actually one of our speakers today, Dr Neria Calvillo at University of Warwick, and Professor Sheila Mallam at Bangor University. And we bring a range of expertise to the network, so air quality, ecosystem services modelling, marine science, freshwaters and flooding, and social science with Neria. And we have excellent network managers who help run things in the background. So we have Charlotte Leden and Mark Simmons. So they're both helping run the call today. Next slide. So our webinars are monthly. They're going to run until February 2025. So they're on the first Wednesday of every month, and they run 12:30 till 1:30 GMT. All of our previous webinars are uploaded to the YouTube channel, and we usually upload those very quickly. So it's typically on the same day of the webinar. So if you want to look back at any previous ones, they're all there. And there's some great stuff, and we get a lot of views on the webinars later. Next slide. Just a little overview on the makeup of the network. So we've got over 620 members now, so we keep growing. And people are interested in a very wide range of topics. So urban green space, some technical things about green roofs or green walls, etc. But people are also interested in things like human well-being, benefits of green space. And the network runs loads of activities. So there's some funded projects, there's some synthesis studies. We've funded a series of workshops and secondments. We've had 2 large engagement events so far, and there's another one planned for early next year. And we've run the photography competition on different types of green and blue infrastructure. And then we have our social media on LinkedIn and Twitter, etc. Next slide. So just a quick flag for one of the recent activities we ran. So this was the photography competition. And the idea is that quite often it's difficult to find pictures of to be honest, it's sometimes difficult to find interesting pictures of parks with people in. But parks are an easy one. Try and find a picture of a balcony or some of these less known types of green and blue space. So the photography competition was an idea to try and get a range of different perspectives on these types of green and blue infrastructure, and particularly looking at it from a different angle, so a non-typical angle. So we ran the competition, we commissioned some artists, and we had open categories as well. And if you go on to, I can't remember what it's called, apologies. It'll be on the website. Wikimedia, that's the one. So if you go onto Wikimedia, you can see all of the photos that people have uploaded, and you can see the winners, and the winners under different categories are just shown here. But you can see every single picture that people have uploaded and hashtagged with the Reclaim competition. So worth looking at that later. Right, on to our 2 speakers today. So we have Dr. Julie Futcher, who's talking about understanding the urban climate rules, and Thomas Kjeldsen, who talks about nature-based solutions case studies. Each presenter is going to have around 15 minutes, so we'll run Julie's first, then Thomas, and then we have a Q&A session at the end, so it's combined at the end. And I think that's it for the background info. Okay, I will just briefly introduce Julie in a bit more detail, So she's a chartered architect and an independent consultant on sustainable urban development. Her research explores the role of London's emerging morphology in the context of climate-responsive urbanism, and focuses on the dynamic and interdependent influence of built form, particularly tall buildings and increasing urban density, on access to passive resources like daylight and ventilation, and in turn building energy management systems which reflect that and make advantage of that, so heating, cooling and ventilation. Her research falls at the intersection of building and urban physics, policy, building and urban climate science, and draws attention to many of the built form outcomes which currently fall outside the broader discussion on sustainable urban development. So a fantastic interdisciplinary mix of interests and skills there. So I will hand over to Julie now.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I think I've turned off all my pop-ups, but if something pops up, I'm really sorry, share my screen.
Yeah, that's come
yeah,
through.
you can see it. Okay, great.
Yeah, doesn't look like the first slide, but
no, it isn't the first slide. I was just running through it. So sorry, you get like a nice sneak preview. It's quite a heavy fold file. So to begin, my name's Julie Futcher. I am an architect from professional practice, and I think that that's really important to mention here. I'm not an academic. So my research, my work, I work with academics and built environment practitioners, and my work focuses around embedding urban climate research into built environment practice. There are decades of urban climate research and billions has been spent on this globally, but our understanding of this as built environment practitioners is really limited. So to address this, we've developed a urban climate walk series, and Reclaim actually sponsored one of those events through a workshop in Ipswich, which was very much appreciated. Thank you. From that, we managed to get some extra funding. We're making a film on Friday, so these rules are going to be the basis of that film. So they're new. Nobody's seen these before. These are straight out of the oven. Okay. And they are likely to change over time. So I've come up with 16 basic rules, and I'm just going to whiz through those. It'll take me a little while to get into this because I'm always a bit slow to start. So I press the button. Maybe it wants me to do that. Okay, so I'm going to just read this little bit, and then we'll just kind of whiz through lots of slides that are going to demonstrate what I'm talking about here. In the urban setting, understanding the spatial complexity of the interdependent net energy relationships at a range of scales requires an interdisciplinary approach and a comprehensive set of tools that integrates existing urban knowledge and terminology at a fundamental level. Currently, this interdisciplinary approach is missing from built environment perspectives, both nationally and internationally. Incorporating these needs into policy and practice is complex and requires a fundamental shift in our current methods for evaluating the performance of buildings, both individually and in their urban setting. Bridging this gap calls for innovative frameworks that transcend traditional silos, linking net energy performance with urban design decisions to create sustainable, healthy and resilient cities. Here we introduce a critical urban climate infrastructure framework that identifies built form as a key component of green, blue, grey infrastructure. We explore this framework through the urban climate rules. Okay, it's not, I'm going to have to just spin my mouse. Okay, so then rule number 1 is urban climate effects are spatial and temporal in nature. They're dynamic, site-specific, and completely dependent on the background condition. There are 2 driving forces here. That's the thermal effects, that's access to solar radiation or the energy balance of the surface, and airflow dynamics, how the air moves through cities, helping to remove heat and pollution or not. These effects are shaped by latitude, atmosphere dynamics, and the climate zone, humidity. there are no universal relations. So every single town that you look at, city you look at around the world will have a completely different set of outcomes. But there are common themes. Basically, these themes are linked by urban geometry, height-width ratio specifically, and these height-width ratios in turn are generally created by specific functions. For example, in central urban areas, we tend to have the tall commercial buildings. But these effects, as I said, are spatial and temporal nature and depend on which way the wind's blowing. Sometimes you might have a cool day, the air blows over the city and it picks up all those signals from the underlying setting and will dump that heat somewhere else. You might not have any urban climate effect at all, or it might be located in the center of the city, or you might have various varying hotspots. This is as the warmth, as the cool comes in, the urban environment can help remove that cold from the air and warm the city. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Urban climate effects are not all negative. There are lots of benefits to them, but it can often also result in high levels of pollution. Oh, I keep pressing the button, but it's only I have to keep spinning the mouse. Sorry about that. So when we think about the urban climate, we typically see images that were like up here on the top right, which is a isobar map that's telling us about the urban heat island intensity. But what's really important to notice here, to understand here, is where that measurement of that intensity, the difference between the urban and the rural, is being taken and when it's being taken. For example, we often hear that we have an urban heat island of 8 degrees C, as you can see here, but that might be taken from a rural environment, which is flat and completely open and may have water in the soil, allowing heat to be removed quite quickly at nighttime. You might not have any urban climate effect at all. It might be really windy or really rainy, and there's no difference between the rural, or you might not have any urban heat island effect. There might not be any difference between the rural and the central urban area, depending on the background conditions. What's really critical to identify here is where the temperature, what we're looking at, and what is the temperature at that particular point, day or night. The other important point to remember here is that we, as building and urban designers, typically take our building energy management or the climate files from airports, not from fields and parks. We need historic data. So when we're presented with a urban heat island about 8 degrees, you have to ask a question. Where's that coming from? And how has that urban climate difference been identified? How have we urbanized the weather file? Okay, scale is really important. We know there's lots of vertical and horizontal scales that are going on, but we also know that this happens at an intra-urban level as well. And it's about density, horizontal and vertical density. I've just written a report for DULAC, which looks at urban density, particularly building high, on the ecological impacts and biodiversity challenges. This includes things like seed dispersal or what's happening with a green roof at a high level. How is a green roof at a high level affecting me at 75 meters plus, affecting me as I'm walking along a pavement 75 meters below that? Or how are the trees capturing heat and pollution? Are they positioned in a particular way that helps that street to ventilate? And how is the urban form of that street actually influencing those outcomes? Location matters. Rule 3, location matters. So whether you're in the north of England or in the south of England, it's really important. Again, I've just written a report with Savills looking at urban climate risk and resilience, which has identified the importance of actually identifying where you are. One rule does not fit all, I think is really important. Even in a local environment, this is some work we did in Birmingham a few years ago, when you're looking at 2 identical buildings in a city. So they can be occupied in exactly the same way. They can be identical in every single way, but their performance will change as a result of the background, the inter-climate scale differences will influence that performance. And the same as with trees. You can have two identical trees planted at exactly the same time, but their performance will depend on the form of that surrounding system and how the atmosphere has moved over the urban environment, or how the atmosphere of the urban environment has changed as the airflow moves over it. What is that continuous signal of that development and how that influences vegetation health? Of course, geography plays a really important role in that. This has been identified, all the things that we've talked about before, such as where are we getting our background urban climate signal from, where are we in the urban environment, has been addressed through with urban climate research, looking at local climate zones. And there's quite a lot of work out there around this topic. So if you're not aware of the local climate zones, go out and follow Ian Stewart's work or Tim Oakes' work that looks at this. There is a global database that looks at every single city in the world, the whole land cover, that will tell us how these buildings, what that land cover is. And from that, we can make assessments about how that land cover will be influencing the background climate. Of course, a view of sky matters. We always know this. Sky view factor is quite a well-known geometric parameter for allowing heat to leave the urban system, and height to width ratio is a well-known parameter for allowing heat to enter the system, or sunshine to enter the system. But of course, building height to street width ratio also needs to be considered along with latitude and orientation. Solar angle is really important here. The sky view factor typically tells us how heat is leaving the system. It tells us about rates of heat loss. And what we need to think about is what's going on at the top of the canyon is very different than what's going on at the bottom of the canyon. Again, you could have two identical flats, one at the top and one at the bottom, and they will both perform very differently as their exposure to view of sky. A view of sky is a really important parameter, not just in terms of human health, but in terms of how the climate in the lower part of the canyon is performing compared to the top of the canyon. Again, how that influences green and blue infrastructure. Of course, a view of sky matters, but in central London, we've got a huge range of different height to width ratios, lots of density, lots of heat remains trapped between those surfaces. It's not so much the materials that we're looking at here, but how heat and pollution can leave the system, or how heat can remain trapped, adding to our thermal comfort during colder months. Remembering that in the UK, more people still die or are ill related to cold than related to heat-related deaths. So what are these urban climate rules, and how can we use them to our benefit towards addressing resilience? Built form matters. Probably the most famous building here was 20 Fenchurch Street, which redirected the solar beam and burned the car in East Street, more than 60 meters away. What's really interesting about this building, though, there's the surface materials, the glass, which have been shaded, which have been modified, but also the form of the building. So the fabric is embedded within the form of the building, how that modifies airflow and created a disastrous impact on the green infrastructure at its foot. So the green wall needs continuous maintenance. So it's almost like ornamentation, and even the trees have to be regularly replaced at the bottom due to the significant effects of the built form at a very, very local level. We don't know enough about these built form effects day or night. We need to understand more about these. Built form effects are dynamic, far-reaching, and have longevity. Here is a photograph I took in 2019, February 2019, of St Helens Church, Bishopsgate, which has been standing since the 1300s. I took this photo because I saw this beam of light shining through the church window with the tree. Obviously, the leaves are off the tree, and I thought to myself, this is the last time for maybe at least 50 years that sunshine is going to shine through that window or even reach that tree. Now, due to the construction of another building in the eastern cluster, the only way sunlight enters that building is by reflecting off of 100 Bishopsgate, redirecting it into the square. So you have your shadows to the south of you rather than to the north of you. Daytime, nighttime effects are really important. So it's not just about the urban heat island. The urban heat island refers to the way heat leaves the system. It refers to rates of heat loss compared to an open site. What is the temperature differences in terms of how heat is received, held and released? But the biggest difference is in terms of how heat is released from the urban system. This photograph is in Hong Kong, a thermal photograph of the surface temperatures of these towers in Hong Kong. And we can see that the tall buildings in the night time at 2 a.m. are cool. In the daytime, they're receiving all of that solar radiation. But the deep central canyons have not yet received solar radiation and they have not yet started to warm, or not as warm as the top of the canyons. And at night time, that heat remains trapped between those surfaces, causing huge problems. It's not just about the urban heat island. This is a study that we worked on with for the City of London. We found in the Eastern Cluster, where we just looked at the photograph of St Helens, that the air temperature difference in that at that point is 8 degrees C cooler in the summer than in Finsbury Square, which was our Finsbury Square Gardens, which is point number 1 of the Urban Climate Walk, which is our base site. 8 degrees cooler in the summer in this central urban location. So where we're supposed to have our biggest urban heat island intensity, we actually have a negative effect. We have a massive reduction in thermal temperature. And of course, it's not just about the urban heat island. It's not just about overheating, it's also about air quality as well. And we've also found in the Eastern Cluster, through the work that we did with the City of London, that we actually had some of the best air quality in the City of London. This work was taken a few years ago. We're now doing another study, 2019 I think. We're now doing another study that's looking at the same thing. We know that the air quality in the city has improved significantly, but these airflow effects are still happening. And what is the impact that they're having on air temperatures? There is a huge difference between surface and air temperatures. Surface temperatures are typically driven by green infrastructure. You can see here from the work that we were doing in Birmingham, that when we think about density has the biggest impact on air temperatures. It doesn't really match surface temperatures. The blue figures are air temperatures, daytime air temperatures. You can see that they're pretty cool. And the red figures in the middle are the surface. So this is the air temperature heat island, the surface heat island, and the underlying surface cover. We find that urban heat islands air temperatures match density. We find that surface urban heat islands really match green infrastructure, or the level of vegetation, or the level of permeability that we have. And we can see that there's a close correlation there. So when we're looking at air temperatures, we need to understand density. When we're looking at surface temperatures, we need to understand what the material qualities are. There are huge impacts on these two outcomes on health and well-being, not just for human beings, but for all living things in our urban setting. Buildings are not energy islands. This is another set of studies that we've done looking at the influence of built form on the direct heating and cooling loads of buildings in the urban setting. We also found at this point that vegetation health was really poor. Where we have these really tall buildings, vegetation health doesn't really help us. Vegetation doesn't really help us. The effects of these buildings are so powerful that they actually override what's going on with the vegetation. A generic approach is insufficient. We've looked at various built form outcomes over the years, and we found that this is what we identify as built form outcomes. This very small palette of ideas here. These are the things that we consider in terms of urban climate resilience. But actually, when we include built form effects, this whole matrix becomes a lot more significant. We start to include all sorts of things like orientation, shading, airflow. It's a much more complicated network matrix by including built form effects. The role of the urban commons. This is probably one of my favourite topics, and one unfortunately I'm not going to be able to talk about in much detail here. But when we talk about the urban commons, we're basically talking about the net energy effects and our right to clean and comfortable air. These built form effects are significant. They actually have a long-lasting impact on the climate of our streets. There are lessons that we can learn here that we can take down to where we live, how we apply them, how it's really important, how we redirect solar radiation, how we can bring air into our streets to help ventilate them, to make the air clean and comfortable. All really important factors. And also what we need to understand is the timing of the building function. The central urban area has central urban areas in general have a very powerful, have a strong urban heat island intensity, 2 or 3 degrees. This will have a significant impact on nocturnal well-being. The urban heat island is typically a nighttime effect. If you've got office buildings and they're not occupied, doesn't really matter so much. If you have residential buildings that are occupied at night, it becomes really important to understand the timing of these functions and how they coincide with the timing of the building, the urban climate effects that you're looking at. This is another piece of work that we looked at in terms of form and function through the first steps in urban heat, which I worked on with the lovely Emma Ferranti. If you haven't investigated her first step series, I suggest it because it's pretty cool. And water matters. This is another piece of work from Bath, actually, from Tristan and Petros, who I'm working with on urbanizing the weather file, who's looked at water and has found when you look at still water, it has a different effect on warming night and day. And actually, it can generate warmer effects at night time. So it can actually increase or slow rates of cooling of in urban canyons when you have a pond or a still body of water. So this is really important to think about. The last final rule, open space is a key driver of urban climates. Here we are in the rain, in the park in Ipswich, on the walk that was supported by the Reclaim network. Thank you very much. It's really important to notice here that we're standing on a hard, wet surface, and behind us is this this grass that's absorbing the water here, allowing the water to penetrate but into the soil to help with the cooling effects of parks. But what's really important here is this openness to sky and how heat can easily leave the system. There's no obstructions to heat loss. It doesn't necessarily have to be about this is the next this little QR code here will take you to the next urban climate walk in Ipswich. It's not just about green infrastructure. It's not just about hard surfaces. It's about openness to sky. Here we've got, I live in Islington. I'm an Islington resident. I live near Angel. This is the Sainsbury's car park in Culpeper's site. It is on one of the highest points in North London as it goes down to the river. It's also the catchment area for the Walbrook. This has been discussed in Stephen D. Meyer's PhD, which can be found here under this QR code that looks at the catchment area. Sainsbury's car park is a hard surface at night and it's not occupied at nighttime. At nighttime, that open space really helps to remove heat and pollution from the surrounding area. It's really important to understand the role of open space as a key driver of urban climates. It's not necessarily about it being green, although of course green is much better, but actually about having open space. So this all builds into describing what a critical urban climate infrastructure framework is. If you're interested in finding out about that, I suggest you come on the next Urban Climate Walk, which is Thursday, the 19th of September, City of London at 5:30. And this QR code will take you to my Eventbrite page. Okay, hopefully that was 15 minutes.
That was a little bit over, but it was all
sorry.
incredibly interesting. So thank you very much, Julie.
Oh, it was a race. It was a race.
It was packed full of information, really helpful. We'll have some questions later. So there's one question in Q&A, I think. But yeah, please add some more. Before that, though, we're going to have our second speaker. So I will just briefly introduce Thomas. Just bring up his bio. So Thomas specialized in water resources engineering before moving to the UK. Following a year working as a consulting hydrologist, he spent a decade working as a research scientist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And in 2013, he joined the University of Bath, where he's researching and lectures on topics of water engineering and infrastructure resilience. He's also a trustee of the Bristol Avon Rivers Trust, working to improve water quality in the local area. So thank you, Thomas, and I will hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Laurence. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you fine, and we can see the presentation as well.
All right, thank you very much. So thank you. Yeah, my name is Thomas. I am an academic at the University of Bath, but I'm presenting here in my capacity as a trustee of the Bristol Avon River Trust. And what I'm going to talk about is some examples of the work we've done on implementing nature-based solutions in the local area. And my thanks goes to our very capable CEO, Simon Hunter, who has led on a lot of this work. So who are we as a trust? As a river trust, we're one of, I think, almost 70 river trusts scattered around the country. It's a charity. It's a small charity. It started out small, but it has now grown as the interest in nature-based solutions and river environment in general increases. So we are now almost got 20 employees almost. It's a charity that tries to reconnect communities in and around the Bristol Avon catchment with their river environment, and also undertake work to try to improve the water quality in the catchment. So of course, I think most people are probably aware that water is important. Rivers are full of fresh water, and they're supplying, very vital to the ecosystem services that's provided to us, both in terms of natural capital, things we extract from it, but also as a mean of recreation, a place where people like to spend their time as well, and of course supporting all the ecosystems and the wildlife. The problem is that our waterways are under severe pressure from human activities. And this is a map of the status of the water bodies, so rivers and lakes, in the Bristol Avon catchment. So if you're not familiar with the Bristol Avon catchment, this is Bristol over here on the left, and the main river runs here, and here's the city of Bath, and then up to Wiltshire where the headwaters is. But we've got lots of tributaries here from the Mendip Hills, from Sainsbury Plains, to running in. And what you see on this map here is the color of the streams is mainly yellow, which means failing the European Union Water Framework Directive. So most of the waterways in this catchment have not achieved good ecological status. There's also some little icon with fish, which is the Fish Directive, which we primarily fail in most regions as well, in particular in and around the built-up areas, especially Bristol and Bath, and in the highly agricultural bits, which are sort of in the southern bit here. So there are lots of quality, water quality and ecological challenges in the catchment. So the River Trust has taken on the mantle of trying to promote relatively cheap, affordable, it's all relative, of course, nature-based solution to try to implement this throughout the catchment. And there's been a lot of challenges in doing that, lots of successes, but a lot of challenges as well, especially promoting these schemes, as we'll see through some examples, related to engagement with stakeholders, being you have to convince skeptical farmers, you have to get things through the local authorities, planning systems, etc., etc., which makes it, you should think, straightforward, and most people probably would find it hard to disagree that these are good solutions, but actually it's from good intention to implementation, it's actually not always that straightforward. But yeah, so what we as the charity is promoting is relatively straightforward and low-cost interventions based on things like hedges, tree planting, restoring soils, building buffer strips, wooden debris dams, etc. Things that can be done at a relatively low price that are also inspired by nature and working with nature. And of course, the benefits we're hoping to provide is reducing. A big issue is erosion and sediment delivery to the streams, try to keep the sediment on the land. Flood risk is an important topic, by increasing biodiversity, and also in enhancing the ability of the local communities to actually connect and engage with the river environment. So I'll go through this relatively quickly, but we have some I have here some examples of projects that have been delivered by the trust. So is case study number one, which is a field. So this is a farmer that owns this field, and they have owned this field for generations and farmed in the same way. And the problem they were having is that, as you can see, the way they had managed the land and the buffer strips around the edges of the fields and the local streams had over time led to really high sediment yields and nutrient runoff into the local waterways, so much so that they had to dredge several times a year to try to avoid flooding the local road networks, etc. So not only is that inconvenient, it's also very expensive. So the farmer was approached. The farmer approached the trust, and together they worked together to try to come up with solutions. And it turned out that the solution here was proposed was a buffer strip, so sacrificing some of the land on the edges of the field in order to try to prevent this runoff from happening. So here's here's a picture of before and after. You can see on the left is before, a waterlogged field where lots of sediments are eroded and run straight into the local ditch, into the river system. On the right is the restored buffer strip. So the farmer gave up. It's about somewhere between 10 to 15 meters along the edge to build buffer strips, scrapes, sediment traps, etc. And this is what it looks like now. I think ideally the trust had asked for 20 meters, but that was seen as being a little bit too much of an economic sacrifice, so they had to settle on this. And this has been a very successful intervention, in that the sediment delivery to the stream has been reduced considerably, so that they now have to dredge less than once a year. At the same time, sort of anecdotally, and this is a theme throughout these, anecdotally, the biodiversity is now thriving in this buffer zone here, a much more diverse biodiversity. At the same time, flood risk downstream have been reduced as well, so there's no longer, because of the lack of the sediment doesn't build up, there's less risk of flooding of the local road network. So multiple benefits from what really is a very simple intervention. So even the farmer, while they were perhaps slightly skeptical in the beginning, have been won over in this case and see this as a good solution. The second example is a wetland creation, and so this is now the River Chew, which runs from the Mendip Hills up, joins the River Avon somewhere between Bristol and Bath in Keynsham. And this was a field that had been bought by people who wanted to rewild the area but didn't really know what to do or how to do it, so approached the Trust to see if they could collaborate on this. So this is a field that had been used for intensive agriculture, so used for intensive grazing, so very compacted soil, low biodiversity, and also was perceived as having a fairly high runoff rate, negatively affecting downstream communities. So the idea here was to try to build a wetland, connect this land more with the floodplains again, and try to slow down the flow. See if we could retain some of the runoff on the site via a wetland, thereby reducing downstream flooding and sediment delivery again, while at the same time increasing biodiversity. So there was an intensive work here of planting hedgerows for biodiversity purposes, but also, as you can see on the right, a sort of semi-natural wetland was created. So the river itself runs down by these trees here, but the water was retained here in a wetland. And again, anecdotally, this has become a haven for biodiversity. So we have seen all sorts of migratory birds, amphibians, insects returning to what was essentially a green desert beforehand. So the last example here is perhaps the driver here was less biodiversity and sediment, but more flood risk management. So we're now in the Cam Brook, which is southeast of Bath. So the headwaters are to the southeast of Bath, and it joins the River Avon just before Bath there. And again, it's old. It's very intensely farmed land with high degrees of runoff during extreme rainfall events, and this frequently led to flooding of the local road network, and parts of the farm became inaccessible, which was a bit of a problem because there was also livestock there that couldn't be reached during some of these events. So the idea here was to come up with a scheme that could literally slow down the flow, hold back water during extreme rainfall, and then release it slowly once the rain has passed. So to avoid this pulse of rainwater coming very quickly down these very relatively steep hills, causing flooding on the local road network, etc. So what was proposed and designed and implemented here was a series of attenuation pond and wooden debris dams to try to slow the flow. And the sort of solution we're looking at is what you can see on these images here. So it literally is wooden debris dams. So you see here, it's like a tree trunk. So the water is running from where we're looking at this tree trunk and then into the picture down the hill. So literally, it's putting debris dams, wooden debris, tree trunks here at different locations down here to try to slow the flow down. So creating less of a gradient for the water, so reducing the velocities at which the water flows. Because the higher the velocity of the water, the more sediment it can carry. So if you can slow down the flow by putting in barriers, lifting up the water a bit so you get a slightly less gradient, you will start to get fallout of sediment of the water and reduce the sediment delivery. At the same time, you'll slow the lag time down as well, so water travels less quickly, which means you get less of a peaky flood event. So this is probably one of the least exciting videos you'll see, but this is what it looks like. So the water comes down, and you can see here that sediment is starting to build up again behind these wooden debris dams here. So this like becomes a little pool, and the sediment builds up. And on a greater scheme, this is what it looks like. So we've got a series of attenuation ponds. So the water comes streaming down, gets stored in a pond, and when you have water stored in a pond, you increase the retention time, and it simply takes longer for it to reach downstream. By which time you will have lowered the peak flow down, so there's less of a problem with flooding of roads and other infrastructure further down. So those were just a quick tour de force through some 3 examples of how our River Trust has got about working with landowners, working with local authorities, working with local communities to come up, implement, and design and implement very low-cost nature-based solutions. So to conclude, I mean, we obviously have a fairly positive view of these are cost-effective solutions, and we think they do what we say they do, but we're not entirely sure, and we haven't quite quantified. So we think anecdotally that these things are working, but of course it would always be good to have more evidence, more scientific studies, etc. So I will encourage anybody with an interest in nature-based solution, water, runoff, etc. If you're interested, get in touch with the trust. We're always keen to work with people from universities and research organizations and individuals who are willing to work on the same vision of trying to connect communities to the local river environment. So, bit of a tour de force, but thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and nicely on time as well. If you just want to stop sharing. Fantastic. Now we can see everyone. So we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I think my colleague Prashant, Professor Prashant Kumar, is going to lead the Q&A. So Prashant, are you there?
Yeah, you can hear me well, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so thank you very much for the fascinating talks. And they're quite complementary in the sense that, one talking about the urban greening and heat waves, and another talking about flooding. And these are the biggest challenges in the urban and rural areas these days. I've got one question here from Professor Sheila Malam, and she's also one of the co-leads of the Reclaim Network, and that's for Julie. And she says that, has there been any work on the amount of glass in buildings in relationship to the amount of heat in urban environments?
There has been lots of work into embodied carbon, but again, it's one of those things we're just looking at as in isolation. Of course, embodied carbon is really important, but also is the form a building takes is really important in terms of managing its own climate and the influence it will have on the wider environment. So let's just look at it this way. Let's suppose that we have a building that's perfect in every way. It's being made out of 100% recycled materials. It doesn't use any energy to operate, and all of it's perfectly okay. But the form of that building can actually create a negative impact on the wider environment. So the net energy effects of that building on the surrounding environment, including the health and well-being of all living things, is actually negative. Our focus is on that. Our focus is on the silo, buildings as energy islands that they're not. The way that we need to look at it is that what is the net energy effect of built form on the wider environment? How far reaching are those effects? My talk wasn't about heat waves. It was about understanding the role of built form as part of green and blue and grey infrastructure. And the question about glass is a really important one, because while we're focusing on one effect, we're losing sight of all of the others. And actually, glass can be very useful for office buildings in terms of not storing any heat and reducing the urban heat island effect. But the issue with glass, of course, is there are high cooling loads, which are dominated by the building function, but also that it's very difficult to get hold, to dig out of the earth now, or to scrape off of the beach. But we just need to broaden the palette of what we mean by embodied carbon and green, blue and grey infrastructure. I think that that's the point. But come on the walk and we can discuss it in more detail.
Could I come in on that, sure. Prashant? So one of the things that I noticed is walking in certain urban areas where there's a lot of glass, you're getting a lot of heat directed from the glass directly to you or down into that, and it's actually increasing the heat within that area rather than reducing it. And I'm wondering if, you know, within the structures and everything else that's going forward, whether actually you need to be careful of how that glass is orientated in relation to the sky and everything else.
Of course. But when we go to those central urban area, the Eastern Cluster, and we look at those glass buildings, we look at that mountain of glass buildings, we find we've got an 8°C cooling effect going on in there. So the shading is really important. When you're talking about redirecting solar radiation, that could be a really useful effect if it's cold. If it's cold, this is where green infrastructure really comes in. If it's cold, you've got trees with no leaves on, the sun can get there, you can add heat to the system, you can make it warmer, we can use less energy, it's more resilient. In the summer, you've got trees, they've got all their leafy bits on them, shade in the environment, but trees are generally small compared to the size of these buildings. So if you have clusters of buildings that are shading each other, you know, we're not going to knock any more buildings down. I think that we've agreed that what we've got is here forever. And so we are going to be modifying the surface of those buildings. We're going to be changing the fabric or the outside materials, and how we do that. We need to really think about what are those wider impacts. So redirected solar radiation can be really damaging, but it can also be really useful. We just need to understand what the rules are.
Okay.
Lessons learned.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Julie, there is one more question for you from Jacqueline Fletcher, who is one of our PhD students. She's asking, based on your research, what are your recommendations from built form design strategies in urban commercial centers and or special commercial districts?
Well, those buildings are not occupied at night, but we do need to be mindful of how we cool those buildings. Cooling strategies are really important to make sure that we understand what the effects are, what is the urban effect on our climate file to be able to identify how to cool those buildings. Of course, vegetation is really useful. Ban cars, I would say, in all central urban areas. That would be my go-to rule every time. Plant more trees, of course. Trees will make more comfortable areas. But even in some really hostile environments, such as the Eastern Cluster, people still go there for lunch. But what's really important to remember here is about function. So those buildings were designed for office function. So all of the airflow and solar dynamics that are going on at that site, you only have to worry about 1 hour for lunchtime eating, and maybe some people drinking outside in the pub at 6 o'clock on 3 o'clock on a Thursday. But if we were to change the function of those buildings, if we were to keep the form exactly the same, and we were to change the function of those buildings to residential buildings where we have people on walking sticks and pushing pushchairs and all of those difficult day-to-day activities that we go about, we need to really think about what are these built form effects. And they do impact on vegetation health. And at the moment, they're not included. So this is a call to broaden the palette. Let's broaden the palette of what we mean and start thinking about what these well-known identified effects are. Like I said at the beginning, there's been billions and decades of research into this. It exists. It's real. So let's explore it.
Thank you very much. I believe we can take another question or two. If you have any questions, please write in the Q&A box. In the meantime, maybe I can ask a question from Thomas. So Thomas, these case studies are very interesting and very low cost and quite effective, especially in the context where, you want to support actually this, the farmers. And I don't want you to go into the, the very kind of expensive solutions. But they somehow could also remain contained in that particular a solution or particular place. So the question I have was whether there has been work actually which Trust has been doing to create some sort of data around them, so or you can tell the quantification, the impact of these solutions, and then could kind of create actually the basis for the studies to be rolled out elsewhere. Because otherwise, it will remain in the pictures and it says it works, but then a lot of people want the evidence on that.
I think that's an excellent question, Prashant, and I think you put your finger right on the difficult bit. I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of evidence missing, and I think for a small charity and for a farmer or for some private people trying to do good, doing scientific rigorous studies of before and after and effects is probably beyond the means and also the skill set to some degree. So that's why. So I'd say no. The evidence base is the rigorous scientific evidence base is probably, I would say, low. I don't say it's completely missing, but it's probably low. But we're quite an active organization that gets included in lots of things, and there is capacity and interest within the trust to work with universities, and we have started doing that as well to try to put more rigor into this, because it's definitely in our interest as a charity to have this evidence, because that's how we can convince more people that this is a beneficial way forward. So the call is really open. The door is always open to talk to people with an interest in working with us on these issues.
Yeah, but I believe that wearing the hat of an academic and being part of the trust, I think it opens up an opportunity to bring the academic interest into it. So, that lots of research goes on the university. They try to look for these kind of sites, actually. And this is a fascinating place to create some real world impact.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so if there is no other questions, so I'm going to pass on to my colleague, Professor Jones, to take you to the last part of this seminar. So, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending, and incredible thanks to our two speakers for really interesting talks today. As I mentioned at the start, the recording of this will be on YouTube with the other webinars later today. So encourage your colleagues to view it if they wanted to attend but couldn't. Just a brief plug for the next webinar, so number 29 in the series on the 2nd of October. So we've got two speakers. So Professor Glenn McGregor is talking about heat waves in the urban environment, and Sasha Gibb is giving quite a different perspective. So the public voice, common ground, public engagement, and the public realm. So two very different perspectives, but that looks to be a really interesting webinar. So I invite you along next month. And this is just a reminder of our various social media links. So if you want to follow what the network's doing, join the network. It's quite easy. It's free to join. These are the links, and you can just search Reclaim Network in a search engine of your choice.